Athens, Ohio, Thursday, 7 May 1964. During a commencement speech at Ohio University, the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas, who's been the president for less than 6 months at this point, having, of course, assumed the office on 22 November 1963 upon the assassination of his predecessor, John F. Kennedy, is giving a brief outline of the domestic policy objectives for his new administration when he uses, for the first time, in public at least, the term Great Society. He uses the term again 2 weeks later on 22 May during another commencement address, this one at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, in which he offers a more fleshed out description of the upcoming policy initiatives that he plans to have his party pursue in the Congress. It was during his first State of the Union address back on 8 January of that same year, 1964, that President Johnson, speaking a mere 5 weeks after the death of President Kennedy, and pulling out all the stops to portray himself as the designated torchbearer for the legacy of the slain president cut down so tragically in his prime, first declared that on his watch the federal government was going to wage a war on poverty, in which the federal government, through a smorgasbord of new spending initiatives and entitlement programs, was going to guarantee a minimum standard of living for all Americans. And this idea became the nexus of the legislative package that came to be known, starting on 7 May of that year in Athens, Ohio, as the Great Society. Now, in understanding the Great Society, it's important to first understand that ever since the dawn of the 20th century, the leftist socialist wing of the Democrat Party has been very adept at using, whenever possible, the political exigencies of the moment as an opportunity to ram through all of their preferred big government socialist policies that they otherwise would not be able to get through the Congress. Franklin Roosevelt used the Great Depression as a springboard to ram through a whole host of socialist policies which he and his supporters called the New Deal. Today's leftist Democrats, though admittedly that may be a redundant term because there are precious few non-leftist Democrats these days, Joe Manchin notwithstanding, they're using the COVID-19 pandemic to try and ram through all the socialist policies that they want. And so, it was no different in 1964 when Lyndon Johnson tried, quite successfully as it turned out, to cloak himself in the mantle of the late President Kennedy and to leverage public sympathy to ram through the raft of socialist policies that came to be known as the Great Society. But here's the thing about Kennedy and Johnson. They were two very, very different kinds of Democrat. Kennedy, on the one hand, was a racial progressive, but he was not particularly liberal, and he sure as shit was not a socialist. He was a conservative Democrat, back when there was still such a thing as a conservative Democrat. In fact, if he didn't hail from a family of prominent Massachusetts Democrats, he might have entered politics as a Republican, because there were wide swaths of his political worldview, particularly in the areas of foreign policy, national defense, and anti-communism, where Kennedy was much closer to conservative than liberal. Jack Kennedy could never be considered a Democrat in the 21st century. He could barely be a Republican. CNN would malign him as a right-wing maniac. Johnson, on the other hand, was decidedly not a racial progressive. When he was whipping up congressional support for the Civil Rights Act of 1965, he routinely and casually referred to it as the N-word bill, dozens of times a day. But he was most decidedly a liberal and a socialist. Kennedy and Johnson were bitter rivals during the 2 years that both were in the Senate. They were bitter rivals for the Democrat nomination in 1960, as they each represented a different wing of the party. And when Kennedy gained the nomination and decided that his best chance of winning the general election was going to be to unite the party by offering Johnson the number 2 spot on the ticket, his own campaign manager, who was also his little brother and his future attorney general, was so horrified at that prospect that he very nearly quit in protest. But as it happened, Bobby Kennedy wound up being the guy who had to go up to Johnson's hotel room and offer him the vice presidential nomination. Now, it's commonly believed by a lot of Americans that in terms of the federal-level socialist-style entitlement programs that are still a part of our lives today, that they mostly came from Roosevelt and the New Deal, but that is not the case. Aside from Social Security, there's not all that much that remains today of the New Deal. Many of those initiatives ran their course and didn't survive the Second World War. Others were passed by Congress but struck down by the Supreme Court, and some slowly faded away but still exist today, only in some vestigial form that doesn't affect the lives of all that many people. In terms of the federal level socialist programs that still exist today, that still create transactional relationships between the individual citizen and the central government, the vast majority of those came from the Great Society. You've got two cabinet level agencies to start with: transportation and housing and urban development, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, the National Endowment for the Arts, PBS, NPR. That is all Great Society stuff, and probably none of it ever happens without Kennedy getting assassinated. Everybody knows that was a real inflection point in the history of the American Republic, but many people don't realize. They don't realize by a long shot just how much of an inflection point it was in terms of the direction that domestic policy wound up taking in the second half of the 1960s. The Great Society policies may have been perfectly well-intentioned, but in terms of the facts on the ground, to use the fashionable parlance, the biggest and worst effect was the wholesale destruction of the Black American family unit. At the start of 1965, 70% of Black Americans were born to a mother and a father who lived together and were married. Today, that number hovers around 20%. In guaranteeing that the federal government would keep everyone above the poverty line, the Great Society created a perverse incentive for poor women, and black women in particular, to have children out of wedlock. As long as you kept having babies and never got married, that was a guarantee that your benefits were always going to go up. And the urban renewal efforts of the Great Society, they had a similarly disastrous effect. Instead of improving conditions in existing poor neighborhoods, it was decided instead to build a bunch of high-rise housing projects in every major American city and fill them up with welfare recipients. Hundreds of these places were built between 65 and 75, and they became hellscapes of crime and drug use and suffering and human despair. By the mid to late 80s, those places were all being torn down because nobody wanted to live in them, and with good reason. But until Bill Clinton ran for president in 1992, there was no prominent Democrat who was willing to say that the Great Society had been an abject failure, and that we desperately needed reform of all those Great Society entitlement programs that caused the failure in the first place. And when he won the election, and there was welfare reform, and when it was time to run for re-election, he declared in a speech that I referenced in the last episode that the era of big government is over. Today, all the lessons of the Great Society have apparently been unlearned. Socialist Democrats are trying to ram through the exact same policies that failed so spectacularly in the 60s and 70s, and many of them seem to not even realize that these things have already been tried, and they don't freaking work. Some, at least, have the excuse of being too young to remember, but Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi, they don't have that excuse. They just want to grow the government and take your money. They care not at all about the human cost of ramming through policies that are already failed and will never ever succeed, even if you call them by a different name and dress them up with a different colored bow. Jim Eagle, hit the music, please. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where the only entitlement program is you get a free tankard of meat if you kill an enemy in battle. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. Happy Friday. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And do you remember last year, around this time, when healthcare workers were being fetishized within an inch of their lives by our political leaders and the fake news performance artists, and over at America's Intellectual Short Bus, also known as Celebrity Twitter, they were scolding you for being insufficiently worshipful of the essential workers, and especially the doctors and nurses whom they were describing with every screamingly inappropriate military metaphor in the whole book of inappropriate metaphors. They're working on the front lines, they screamed. They're in the trenches. They're putting their lives on the line. In fact, if you don't bow down and pray at the altar of our healthcare heroes, they said, then you are a bad person. In fact, you're not a real American. You're a commie bastard. You probably helped Putin steal the election for Trump, you vodka-swilling, chess-playing bastard. But my oh my, what a difference 1 year and a new political narrative make. Because starting this week, all across the country, tens of thousands of those same people they wanted us to worship last year, they're being summarily fired from their jobs. Was there anything insufficient about the manner in which they perform their duties? Nope. Are the hospitals and clinics so overstaffed that these people were laid off because they had no work to do? Nope. No, these doctors and nurses are being fired because they will not comply with Joe Biden's ridiculous, draconian, anti-scientific vaccine mandate. And make no mistake, even if it's not being done directly by the government, this is all 100% of it Joe Biden's doing, because the hospital and healthcare systems that are doing the firing are trying to make themselves look good to the federal government, just like the airlines are, who have also fired thousands of people for no good reason this week. Even if the federal mandate winds up getting struck down by the courts, which is pretty likely to happen, provided our judges still remember how the law works. These companies are very eager to signal their obedience and their virtue to Grandpa Joe, their benevolent overlord in Washington. Look, Grandpa Joe, we fired all those very bad unvaxxed monsters because we want you to know that we hate people who disobey your orders just as much as you do. And hey, if people start dying in our hallways and our waiting rooms just because there are no doctors and nurses to care for them, well, that is just the cost of performative obedience to our political overlords, and it is such a small, trifling price to pay. Aren't you pleased with us, Grandpa Joe? Can we have our ice cream now? Now, for the past 18 months, it happens every day, more times than we would care to count. Our self-appointed overlords have leaned into the phrase, in the middle of a pandemic, like it's some sort of rhetorical Swiss Army knife that can be used for any purpose you need it for. We can't do this in the middle of a pandemic. We can't do that in the middle of a pandemic. Do what? In the middle of a pandemic? Are you insane? And one would think, if one were even tangentially connected to reality, that firing thousands of doctors and nurses in the middle of a pandemic would fall under the heading of things you never do in the middle of a pandemic. But no. The people who portray themselves as the guardians of science, the people who hold themselves up as the supreme arbiters of objective truth, the people who have scoffed indignantly for a year and a half at anyone who questions their single-minded commitment to something called public health, they are now telling us that public health demands firing thousands of doctors and nurses in the middle of a pandemic. They don't even attempt to offer any scientific justification for it, because there is none. If they tried, they would just sound stupider and more dishonest than they do anyway. Has there been any outbreak, any super spreader event, to use the trendy scientific lingo, that's been traced to unvaccinated healthcare workers? Nope, there sure hasn't. And it stands to reason, doesn't it? If you've been in a hospital or anywhere near a hospital since March of last year, you don't need me to tell you that nobody is allowed inside a hospital who isn't the actual patient, and that all of the personnel working in the hospital are required to wear so many layers of personal protective equipment that they look like they're on the goddamn cleanup crew at Chernobyl, which begs a rather obvious question. If unvaccinated people are really so dangerous to the safety of others that they can't be allowed to work in hospitals, then doesn't it stand to reason that all the masks, all the gowns, all the gloves, all the face shields, and all the other assorted forms of PPE are completely worthless and don't do anything? Because you can't have it both ways. It has to be one thing or the other. This isn't even science. This is basic elementary reasoning that your average 5-year-old can grasp just fine. But should we talk about the elephant in the room? Are we allowed to talk about the elephant in the room? Based on YouTube's new stated policy, that basically, it says they'll ban-hammer any video that calls into question any aspect of the regime's current COVID policy, even though that policy changes each time Tony Fauci does a new TV interview, which is about 7 or 8 times a day. I probably shouldn't talk about the elephant in the room, but the hell with it. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. It would seem self-evident and not remotely unreasonable that healthcare professionals who are declining to take the vaccine are declining because they already have acquired immunity, because they've already had the virus. And in the entire history of the science of inoculation, ever since Dr. Edward Jenner first observed that milkmaids never die of smallpox and wondered why that could be, this is the very first time ever that government authorities have advised, even recommended, even mandated that people be inoculated against a virus they have already recovered from. So please, stop insulting my intelligence and telling me this is about science. This is the opposite of science. And stop telling me it's about public health, because you don't give a good goddamn about public health. You care about promoting performative obedience. The doctors and nurses who are willing to get fired rather than comply with a policy they know is contrary to science and contrary to basic common sense, they are people of real moral courage. They have my respect and my admiration, which is a hell of a lot more than I can say for our political and public health overlords who wouldn't know science or moral courage if it kicked them in the balls and stole their fucking wallet. Now, last item for tonight. The vice president has been in the news this week, which is generally never very good news for her. Her public approval numbers were actually beginning to rebound a little bit from the inexorable death spiral they'd previously been in, because she's been invisible and silent for a good month and a half. But when you're as unlikable as she is, it stands to reason that's the only way you can improve your favorability ratings, by staying out of sight and saying absolutely nothing. But then last week's fake Border Patrol whipping hoax happened, and she just couldn't help herself. She couldn't turn away and refuse a slice of that delicious race hustler pie. So she throws together that awkward impromptu news conference that same night, and the next morning she's on The View, cackling her way through softball question after softball question. But even when she's being propped up by a dutiful, water-carrying media, just like clockwork, those approval numbers started sinking again like a manhole cover. And she made matters worse on Wednesday when she was doing some town hall type thing with some college students. I don't know what college it was at, but it doesn't matter. So some female student stands up, seizes the microphone, and spends about a minute and a half giving just about the most nauseatingly anti-Israel, anti-Semitic diatribe ever heard this side of Nuremberg, saying all this crap about how Israel is an apartheid state and a terrorist regime, and they murder little Palestinian kids for fun. And what does the vice president do? She nods and smiles, like the things this maniac is saying are perfectly reasonable and normative. And when it comes time to give her answer, does she do the right thing and say, I'm sorry, but the things you've just said are hateful and offensive and dangerous, and they're just flat out wrong? Nope. She pulled out the most cowardly radical leftist canard of them all. She went to the Your Truth card. She says, your truth cannot be suppressed. Which is a thing that radical leftist liars love to do when they know a thing is completely false, but they don't want to acknowledge it's completely false, either out of cowardice or political expediency. But in the event, I think we can safely assume that falling manhole cover is going to keep picking up speed and approach terminal velocity for as long as the vice president keeps making the mistake of opening her mouth in public and making words come out. But the reason I brought her up is because I received a request to do her ringside introduction, which I haven't done in a while, and I've added some extra embellishment to it. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, fighting tonight out of the Black Lives Matter corner from the mean streets of Berkeley, California, by way of Montreal, Quebec, Canada, please put your hands together for the artist currently known as Vice President Black Masked Grim Reaper Ninja Lady, the California Cackler, the bimbo of the border. She's got more nicknames than Apollo Creed, been passed around more parties than a sack of weed. From Maine to Montana to South Carolina, she's the only vice president who's got a vagina. Call her wrong or call her right, just don't forget that she ain't white. If you're against her, then you're not with her. Everything she knows, she learned on Twitter. She is the blackest Veep in D.C. town, side piece to Montel and Willie Brown. She loves herself some buttered corn. She listened to Tupac before he was born. Give it up for the one, the only, Kamele Harris. Thanks for watching. Have a pleasant weekend. See you Monday. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.